Welcome to the Design of AI podcast, the podcast for product teams. We interview leaders at the forefront of AI and provide in-depth analysis about the industries AI is transforming. Subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple. And join our newsletter to get resources from our guests, plus key insights and strategies to help your business. Get it on our website, designof.ai, or Substack. Generative AI is capturing the attention of product teams, investors, and governments around the world. ChatGPT launched in November 2022 and sparked our fascination with large language models and the possibilities of automating tasks. People are now obsessed with NVIDIA, Sam Altman, Anthropic, and the race to develop artificial general intelligence. But is this moment in time just the latest craze related to an emerging technology? There have been similar hype cycles before related to spatial computing, the metaverse, Web3, crypto, voice-based assistants, and virtual reality. This is AI's latest moment as the hot emerging technology. Back in 2010, the world thought Apple's Siri, Google's Assistant Bixby, and others were going to deliver the promises that we're talking about today in 2024. The truth is that the latest evolution of Gen AI may fail to live up to the expectations, and that businesses will fail to implement it in ways that drive business value and help customers. Leveraging emerging technologies effectively is very difficult because often the actual technology lacks the capabilities that the market actually wants. We saw this when voice assistants, blockchain, and augmented reality all launched into public discourse. They're useful, but not necessary.
In last week's episode with Ben Yoskovich, we talked a lot about venture building, about 0 to 1. Really highly recommend check that out. But emerging technologies have made a significant impact over the last decade. Obviously, AI is here. It's now. It's having impact. And a big part of why it's having more impact are the suite of emerging techs that are built around it. So obviously, machine learning has been developing for a long time. APIs have enabled things. Computer vision are enabling things. But this AI is powering robotics. It's powering biotechnology. We're entering a realm where almost anything is possible because the computing power is there. So as a result of it, we need product teams and entrepreneurs to really reimagine how they investigate and validate these product ideas. The biggest risk with emerging technologies, and this is what we're going to talk about today with our guest, is that it's hard to validate them. Not to immediately say that it doesn't work, but even in our own work, Brittany and I have done a lot of research on emerging tech. The hardest part is adoption. People might tell you straight to your face that this is useful, this will help me, this will save me time. But, A, will they pay money for it? And B, will they even use it? The amount of times that there have been new technologies launched that have failed are just countless. It is quite literally the most frequent outcome of a startup is that you build something great, but people don't want to use it. Ben and Brittany talked about this idea of good enough. Good enough is the biggest barrier to a startup. You can make great, but that doesn't matter. So really, we're going to be focusing in today on how we can conceptualize the idea of these emerging techs, what type of research can help, and more importantly, how can we overcome some of those barriers that limit an organization from thinking ahead rather than thinking backwards?
In today's episode, you'll find a roadmap for any AI product team to improve the likelihood of their product success. So, why researching and building on emerging technologies and net new use cases are so different than mature technologies like mobile apps. When is the right time in the process to bring on researchers? How to make sure you're identifying problems that matter. Why the intended users of the technology is often less important than studying the entire system of stakeholders around the problem. The possibilities of spatial computing and how its future is interconnected with AI, and the risks of not conducting research, especially for emerging technology products.
Let's talk about the mobile phone. Obviously, that's the use case or the case study that everyone refers back to. But the mobile phone reached its pinnacle because of a whole suite of systemic factors that led to it. Most notably, yes, we got the technology small enough to hold in our hand, but the fact was that mobile technology that supports it the speeds of that data were fast enough now that it was useful. Because previous is phones had internet access, but they were, at a dial-up speed. They were, you could play a game and that was about it. So that helped. Obviously, Wi-Fi was becoming more prevalent, so those who didn't have cellular packages could connect to it. The App Store enabled a range of endless possibilities of what could go in there. And we also had basically a lead up of almost 10 years of people holding cellular phones and pagers and such. So it was becoming more and more familiar. The truth is that today emerging tech is trying to be pushed at a pace that is often faster than what consumers are willing to accept or adopt. If you speak to them, a lot of research shows that they're hesitant. And again, in the previous episode, we talked about how today's AI products, particularly at an enterprise level, they're very hesitant in adopting AI because of security concerns about privacy of data, how things will be leveraged and such. So if you are building an emerging product today, you need to be conscious not only of the utility of product, not only how it will or will not be adopted, but what are those barriers to entry? And sometimes they're irrational things. And that, again, is where this qualitative research we're going to talk about today is so critical.
Our guest today has worked as a researcher and strategist on the forefront of some of these emerging technologies, most specifically focused on biometric data and spatial computing. Dr. Llewyn Paine is an innovation strategy consultant with nearly 2 decades of experience in emerging technologies, including mixed reality and AI at Microsoft and experimental media for Disney. She is the founder of Llewyn Paine Consulting and has helped emerging technology teams launch flagship products and secure investments of over $300 million. On June 5th, she'll be presenting at the Designing with AI conference on the topic of deploying AI doppelgangers to de-identify user research recordings.
Hey, Lou Rosenfeld here. I'd love to tell you about a conference that we have coming up at Rosenfeld Media. It's called Designing with AI, and it takes place virtually June 4th through 5th, 2024. We're going to be doing 2 things at this conference. One is we're going to have 10 case studies and demos queued up to show you how UX writers, researchers, and designers are taking advantage of AI today. The other thing we're going to do is make sure we model the questions that need to be asked about how AI can be used in a way that doesn't cause harms. And so we've got some interesting panelists ranging from design ethicists to governance experts to people who specialize in labor. And they're going to be looking at the proceedings of each day and asking some tough questions. And those are the kind of questions that you may want to be able to ask in your workplace. It's all coming up at Designing with AI 2024. Again, it's going to be virtual. Hope to see you June 4th and 5th.
This Design of AI episode is brought to you by PH1 Research, an innovation research consultancy that specializes in turning business questions into product decisions. Over the last decade, PH1 has helped client teams discover, conceptualize, and test product improvements and net new ideas. This has included executive briefings about how to leverage AI and researching which specific use cases and tools your customers want. PH1 has worked on projects for Spotify, Microsoft, the National Football League, Dell, Mozilla, Bell, and various health and higher education groups. With capabilities across product discovery research, service design, rapid prototyping, and in-market testing, PH1 has been a key ally of product and product marketing teams. Visit their website to book an intro call, www.ph1.ca.
Hi, Llewyn. Thank you so much for joining us. So your focus right now is in 2 areas, spatial computing and biometric privacy laws. The second of which is the focus of your presentation at the Designing with AI conference on June 5th. How did you end up down those 2 paths?
They do seem pretty disconnected, but actually it was my interest in spatial computing that led to the biometric privacy work. So I've been involved in spatial computing since pretty much the start of my career, going all the way back to my academic days. I've worked on 3D media, I've worked on smart devices, augmented reality, but one of the technologies that we're really interested in is computer vision and how computers can understand visual scenes, whether that's in real time right in front of us or videos. And so in the course of reviewing some of the new AI video editing tools, I came across something called Wonder Studio, which is a tool for filmmakers to replace actors with computer-generated characters like aliens and robots. And I realized that this is a technology that can help solve a problem we've been facing in product design. In recent years, there have been some changes in information privacy laws. Specifically, there's more concern around faces and voices, which feature very prominently in our user research videos. So of course, we want to hold on to our user research videos as long as possible from a design perspective, because it's expensive to recruit users. There's a lot of rich insight that you kind of can go back to and get more information from. But legal departments are getting concerned about the fact that we have this face and voice information and we're storing it for these long amounts of time. And so using tools like Wonder Studio, we're not necessarily going to want to replace our users with aliens, but we can replace users in our videos with 3D avatars. And what that means is then we have less concern about having someone's face in a video, but we still have all that rich, detailed information content. And so it's this really different way of thinking about how to use these tools, but that unlocks this ability to keep our research more efficient and more effective.
So we've had a couple episodes recently to talk about how AI models are trained. It seems like a giant Pandora's box about, consent, authorization, and such. So I can imagine that this research you're undertaking is invaluable in ensuring that we're training with the right parts. And it makes me think to Google Maps and how Street View is trained on the computer vision, but we blank out people and personal identifying information. Is this kind of the train of thought that this research you're undertaking is about?
Actually, a little different, although you bring up an interesting point about training data. The majority of the work and the types of teams I'm working with are doing more qualitative user research, where it would be human eyes that are going back to watch these recordings. But, there could be similar applications on training models as well. I don't know. That could be a really interesting additional outgrowth.
The main focus of our talk today is about emerging technologies and the challenges in building the right product. We just talked about computer vision, spatial computing. These are all net new ideas as of just a couple of years ago. And we're seeing with Gen AI today a dizzying amount of products being released that only seem kind of useful. And part of it is it's just experimenting with the tech, and it's really an iterative process. A lot of them just feel like plugins or shortcuts or just experiments in fairness. It makes me think of this quote that I saw recently, and it made me think of this conversation. The difficulty lies not so much in developing new ideas as in escaping from old ones. This is from John Keynes. Why do you think it's so difficult to move away from old ideas and towards new ones?
Oh gosh, that is such a challenge. And I think it's a really interesting question because it's something that I think a lot about with my focus on spatial computing. And I think it's the same problem for a lot of AI. I think as user experience professionals, we don't realize how many assumptions are actually baked into the conventional design processes we use. So the cool thing about user-centered design philosophically is that you can, in theory, design anything with it. But for the sake of efficiency, we actually take a lot of shortcuts in our standard design processes because we can. The example that I always think about is the fact that so many teams start with product discovery, whether you are on a UX team or whether you're doing entrepreneurship and you're a founder of some sort. The best practice is always considered you go to your target customers and talk to them about their needs, and then you build a product based on that. But the challenge with emerging technology is you may not know who those customers are. So if you are going in prematurely without really figuring out that this is the right customer for the thing you're designing, you can waste a lot of time. There's also no built-in time to explore what the technology is capable of. And that works fine when you're designing for web and mobile and familiar technologies. But if you're designing for augmented reality or AI or sensors, I find that you really need to have a whole separate part of your process devoted to figuring out what the capabilities and constraints of these technologies even are. Because before you start talking to users, you need to know if this technology is capable of serving them. I think it's hard to be aware of what those assumptions are in our design process. And just in the case of what we were talking about previously, I end up working with teams to have kind of a pre-discovery phase where it's all about exploring the technology and doing some very conscious matchmaking between the capabilities of the technology and new audiences that may not be the ones that they are accustomed to thinking about. But it's real hard to escape those assumptions.
Looking at those types of projects, I'm sure you've worked with some clients that have failed to escape from old ideas. What happens? What does that look like?
I think you said it really well at the beginning. Things that, what was it? Shortcuts and plugins. I think the way that I tend to think of it is you see a lot of teams creating flashy demos, things that might be cool to present at an all hands, but they don't have any real lasting business value. They're not going to be something that continues to be marketed and sold. An example that I see a whole lot in the immersive technology space is every time you have a new headset release, whether it was VR or HoloLens or now the Vision Pro, you will see a bunch of apps to basically build infinite desktops. So you've got these incredible headsets that let you move around in space and see in all dimensions. And the thing that people immediately think of is, oh, I really need a big rectangle. I need a bigger monitor. And, it's not to knock the people who are doing that. Creativity is hard, but I think it's a good example of how hard it is to escape those assumptions. And, the truth is, the friction of putting on those headsets is never going to be worth the giant monitor, at least for now.
So then, what does it look like when those clients or those teams can successfully focus on the future rather than the status quo? Like, how do they get over that hurdle? How do you work with them to reimagine that?
What's interesting about the teams that are good at being future focused is, I can point to these flashy demos. I can't necessarily say what a great future designed product is going to look like. But what I can say is those teams that I've worked with who were really good at that, they tend to do three things. So they are really good at asking questions and getting data to answer those questions. They are not afraid to pivot, maybe a lot early on until they find the right idea. They are not the teams that come in locked into a particular use case and that's what we have to build. And the other thing that I notice with these teams is, and try to bring to these teams, is that they use some kind of framework to make sure that they're getting a good 360-degree view of what they're building. So on the UX side, we can get really focused on whether people want the product, kind of the desirability angle. These models can help you consider things like whether it's technically feasible to build, which is certainly important, but also, is it sustainable? Can you generate enough profit to sustain a business? And I think having that kind of framework makes sure that you're not being too myopic.
I know in research and design world, there's this concept of the problem statement. And quite often organizations, there's business pressure to focus on goals, outcomes, objectives. And the minute that we move from focusing on the problem statement all the way to the goals and objectives, we start skipping steps. We forget, we become misaligned from what people actually need and what we're trying to address and the gaps we're trying to fill. Is that what you're trying to allude to, that these teams are much better oriented towards why they're trying to build this thing rather than what they need to build?
I think that's a really good way of putting it. And, that also highlights the point that not every emerging technology project is really intended to be a product. Sometimes it is just an exploration to see what's possible. And there's no expectation that there will be a business coming out of it. So I think it's important to be very clear if you are on an innovation team, what are your leadership's goals? What are your personal goals for the product you're working on? But if it is to build something that can turn into a business, then I think you really do want to make sure you're getting that broad view and not looking at too much from the single lens of your own background.
I love how you mentioned earlier about Wonder Studio and taking this product that was intended for one use and you've kind of imagined this completely different use for it. And so I think all of us would love to know, what are some other AI products that you're most excited by?
Wonder Studio is the big one for me right now. And, it seems like it's just this thing that you would use in the entertainment industry. But since I have been talking about this and the way we're going to apply this in user research, there have been other applications that have come up beyond entertainment and beyond user research as well. Somebody brought up security footage and the fact that a lot of times you have these videos that may be sensitive. You want to hold on to them because you need some kind of record of an incident, but there might be a lot of people's faces that you don't want to keep in that. So I think as this technology gets exposed to more people, there will be so many more applications than what we would immediately think of. But I think the other thing that's really interesting to me about AI right now, and that I feel is really going to be transformational in the long term, is AI as an enabler for spatial computing. Because AI means that computers are going to be able to understand voice input better and gestures. AI is going to help computers understand the physical world better, which are all the prerequisites for great spatial computing. I think it's clear that spatial computing is something that is coming. We don't know exactly when, but I think AI is going to be a really big part of that.
I'm wondering, what do you see as some of the possibilities for spatial computing that keep you so excited about that space? Like, where do you see spatial computing coming back and wowing us?
So, one of the benefits of having been in the industry for 15 plus years is that I have lived through multiple hype cycles for both spatial computing and AI. I have seen this rise and fall many times. I think the nice thing to remember for spatial computing in particular is even though Apple has been talking about spatial computing mostly in terms of augmented reality, spatial computing is also things like robots, which are seeing a lot of funding right now, Internet of Things and smart devices, the computer vision, which is kind of part of this AI boom as well. But I think there's a really good lesson from Internet of Things in particular. Internet of Things and smart devices had kind of a surge of consumer interest in the early 2010s, and everybody had to have a smart speaker, and everybody was into getting into the smart home business. And then we saw a similar drop off where consumers were no longer as interested in these devices. But IoT did find a home in industry, and now we have industrial IoT, and a lot of businesses are now making really big investments in digital transformation for their factories and warehouses. And so my expectation is that augmented reality is going to go through something similar, and that we're going to see early use cases in industry because there are these massive audiences that information technology has never been able to serve before. Because if you work in a factory, you don't sit at a desk, you don't have a computer in front of you. So I think there's all this untapped potential there. And businesses are the ones who can afford a $3,000 price tag. So I think we'll see the early applications there. And then as we figure out those use cases and the price points come down, then we'll start to see more success with consumers.
Do you think then that Apple's near-term growth is more going to be in B2B, enterprise, or consumer? Where do you see in the short term coming?
Well, that I have to say that is not my personal expertise, but I have seen a little bit of news coverage suggest that there is some stronger B2B interest than consumer interest.
Last month, I believe both Meta and Google announced quite big investments in work in computer vision. Do you think that that will help spark more interest in spatial computing and move that particular emerging technology forward?
I think there is a very natural overlap between computer vision and spatial computing. And it has been interesting to see that there are a lot of new projects that kind of are bringing together computer vision with kind of action on the physical world. I saw one just this morning from a company I think called Everest Labs that's using 3D cameras and robot arms to identify recyclables that are headed for landfills and to remove those.
You know, our last guest, he's from a venture studio, and he was talking that quite often the best startups happen in the unsexy spaces. And you just mentioned one of these, sorting garbage and how computer vision can enable that. I'm assuming that you've had the chance to work on some of these highly functional projects that we don't have the luxury of hearing about.
I think a lot of the work that I have done in industry applications would seem unsexy from a lot of perspectives. I know that it was interesting when I went to work with HoloLens. They were just making their pivot from the early flashy consumer games into their current work with industry. And I think in the general public, there was a kind of a disappointment about where are my cool new augmented reality games. But I think there is so much value in serving industry. And like I said, I really think it's the way forward for augmented reality right now.
Let's pull it back to research for a minute, because I think that is an area that you seem very passionate about. We've done several customer research projects ourselves about emerging tech, and we keep running against a wall, right? Testers struggle to imagine the future unless you show it to them, which is difficult. So, what's been your experience? Like, what have you found has been the most effective way to get testers or users past that struggle to get really deep insights?
Mhm. Yeah, so my experience is exactly the same. We know from cognitive psychology studies that people are just terrible at imagining the future, and if you ask them about it, you're going to get answers that sound confident, but that are actually really bad data to base your business decisions on. In my work, I never ask people to imagine the future, but fortunately, as you bring up, that is not the only way to get customer signal. In a lot of cases, if the idea is well enough developed for prototyping, then that's kind of an obvious way to get people past that block, or story mappings, or storyboarding, sorry, something like that. But I find that in a lot of my work and with a lot of my clients, even that is a little beyond where they currently are. Prototyping can be expensive, and sometimes you want to have a signal before you actually have a fully developed concept. So in those cases, I try to do three things instead. I try to understand what people's assumptions are about the technology, kind of at the general public level. I try to understand what their current workarounds are to solve those types of problems. And I try to look at what happened with previous technologies and previous business attempts to solve that same problem. So, in terms of assumptions about the technology, doing a really good inventory of how things have shown up in popular fiction is so useful. It seems like it's not work because you're like watching movies, but going through and really getting really explicit about exactly how the technology is being used and what assumptions come along with that makes a big difference when you are then talking to users later on. And figuring out what real workarounds exist is such a good benchmark for figuring out what level of success you need to have before people are going to be willing to use something new over what they've been using forever. Have you found any great approaches that work really well in your work?
I think for me, I found one of the more successful ones has been around building on some of the things that you've said about trying to understand people's appetite and understanding of the technology in the first place, looking at what other comparables there are, and then also just going through the process of co-designing with them. So sort of having them imagine new solutions to that problem, agnostic of what we assume the solution will be.
Yeah, and to that point, I think one of the areas that I've found valuable when researching emerging tech has been really trying to prioritize which of those tasks or problems are actually the most important, because quite often what people light up customer service with are not in fact the most critical in terms of making decisions and making change behaviors. And as a result of it, like I've also found that it's good to show them almost examples of other similar technologies, ones that they may not have been exposed to, and see how they would use them or not use them. Because quite often the interface alone can obfuscate what the intent is. So sometimes you want to just test out a huge range of interface types because there's some interaction model that'll excite them, and adoption is often more important than utility.
That's such a good point. Yeah, and I love finding those places where we can look at consumer behaviors on existing technologies. Like one of my favorite examples of that was last year when everyone was talking about the metaverse. Some people were drawing comparisons to the virtual worlds boom in the early 2000s with things like Second Life. And what I love about that is if you look at how people actually used Second Life and kind of get away from the fact that, oh, one's on a computer and one's in a VR headset, you saw some really good predictions of how people's actual behavior would be with the metaverse.
Yeah, it seems like there's just a bit of a sport of polarizing conversation. There was a point when everyone was, obviously really hot on crypto and Web3 and Meta, and then they just went around and started shitting on it. And the fact is, the truth is always in the middle. And for better or worse, when you look historically speaking, as an anthropologist, we all live in some form of a metaverse right now, where our lives are in this liminal space between digital and real, and everything is hybridized. So it's really naive to not, extract insights constantly and to just say it's not going to work. So I really struggle when thought leaders really just crush those ideas immediately.
That's why I love the idea that you're also looking at what's happening in popular culture and science fiction to then gauge people's responses to that and appetite to what's happening from there, because that's also an interesting way to look at what could happen into the future or how people's behaviors and mindsets could be shifting. So, what have you found are low cost and lean methods that you recommend teams leverage to help them make better product decisions?
So I think an issue for a lot of emerging technology teams and innovation teams is that they are often really small and scrappy, especially at the beginning. Like I said earlier, they often have to pivot a lot. So it really doesn't make a lot of sense to put a lot of budget into traditional market research, because you're going to be running these studies and getting signal over and over again. I think in terms of research methods, I have nothing particularly profound to suggest. I usually just try to get everybody on the team comfortable with customer observation and interviews, usability testing, scrappy prototypes that are just about answering questions quickly, preferably as little code and hardware as possible. Cardboard is great. But the other thing that I find really helpful for lean teams is what we talked about earlier about using some kind of framework to guide your innovation. More business-minded teams will use some kind of business model canvas. More design-oriented teams may use something like the DVF framework. So that's from IDEO. It stands for desirability, viability, feasibility. But having a framework like that is really helpful to help you identify what your areas of risk are, which can focus your research questions and make sure you are actually using your methods on the right things.
Can you give an example of a research study that you've run that yielded business critical insights? Like, what did you learn?
So the scenario is you have a team. They are asked to build a new emerging technology product or service. And there's usually someone probably high up in the organization who thinks they know what the right use case is, but there is no data to back this up. So my work with these clients is to help them systematically evaluate multiple possible use cases, including the one from their stakeholder, map that against the capabilities of the technology, and figure out what's going to really work and what's going to really address a user need. So in one of these cases, we found that the original use case they came in with had very little active investment from actual industries in that space. So we talked to subject matter experts, we talked to customers, and they were like, nobody was putting money into this. This is something that everyone pays lip service to, but they're not actually trying really hard to solve this. So in the course of that work, though, we were able to identify a different use case that had more than 10 times greater investment. It could still be very effectively addressed using the technology that they were trying to use. And so they pitched this new idea, this new use case to their board of directors. They changed everybody's minds, and they got this really hefty investment, and were able to pivot away from a use case that would have had no success.
So, do you find that typically that's the process that you would recommend to AI product teams when they're looking to research new use cases? Or would you say that there are different approaches that you would recommend depending on industry or depending on which type of technology they're looking at?
Yeah, I think the general process is always the same with the teams I work with for emerging technology. And it really comes down to what I was talking earlier about how there's this huge value to kind of having a pre-discovery phase where you are really doing a deep dive on the constraints and limitations and capabilities of your technology and challenging yourself to consider different audiences, different use cases, and really systematically doing a comparison between those and making sure that by the time you do get to product discovery and you are talking to target customers, that you have a pretty good chance of success. And then even if you find that there isn't a great application there, you just go down to the next thing on the list because you've prioritized everything. So it can be very effective.
So a big part of emerging technology is you're dealing with people who may have never imagined that there was a better way of doing something. And I'm just going to throw out an example here, and maybe we can talk about how you might research it. But let's say if I was creating a computer vision AI product for farmers, how could you evaluate its viability? Because for many of these people, and we've worked with farmers on some projects in the past, and it's tough because they're very ingrained in their methods. How could you present this new concept to them?
I think an awful lot would depend on what the concept is, and it's difficult to speak too much in the abstract. Um, but I think going back to the methods we talked about earlier, I think the initial step would have to be looking at their existing alternatives very holistically and understanding exactly why it is they're using the approaches they're using, not just from the perspective of could we do it faster or more efficiently, but also what incentives are involved. Are there fears around changing technologies and things not being supported? And we have a way of doing this. What is the opportunity cost of switching? Anytime you're working with farmers or industries, there are these big complex systems that you need to consider. And it's often not sufficient to look at it just from the lens of a discrete set of tasks, but you need to kind of understand the entire system and the other stakeholders involved as well.
You're bringing up this emerging, body of work about systemic design, right? Which is mapping all the players, all the stakeholders, why things are the way they are. And when I think of a farmer example, there's the whole component of, well, should they or would they even have a phone on them? Should they or would they have the time to take this additional step? Should they, would they, need the product in multilingual, because again, the temporary foreign workers play such a big role in it. So looking at it from a very systemic lens seems critical. Are there any tools or practices that you recommend in terms of zooming out from a problem?
And a lot of the work that we've done with industry users, and I haven't worked with farmers, so I don't know that specific example super well. But we will start with subject matter experts that can give us a really high level view of what is the structure of an organization, who are the people who are involved in decision making, who are people who are involved at the task level, and they can really be key in helping us map out those relationships that we can then follow up on with more traditional research methods.
It makes me wonder about adoption and the problem with adoption constantly. Have you learned anything or seen any methods that have been good, or types of questions that have helped in terms of informing someone's actual willingness to use a technology?
So that's always going to be kind of the wild card. And because we know that people are just abysmal at predicting their own future behavior, I don't think there is any question that you can ask that will concretely demonstrate that you will get adoption. So I think the only alternative is running lightweight experiments, as lightweight as you can. But um, whether that's prototyping and leaving the prototype with your potential users and looking at what their actual usage is over time. Um, but it's going to look different for every technology, but figuring out what is the best way you can get a real behavioral signal of how long and how people will use this technology after the initial glitz has worn off, because that's always a challenge too, right? Anytime you have the fancy new technology, everyone uses it for a week and then it starts collecting dust.
Yeah, absolutely. I love how before you were mentioning about in the systemic research and systemic strategy, part of what you're looking at is also why might it fail? Where are the points where it might fail? What are some red flags that you believe teams need to be on the lookout for that could indicate that they need to do more customer or problem discovery?
Yeah, I think the main one is, are people currently trying to solve this problem themselves? If it is a big enough problem and if it's something that's worth spending money on, then there would be some signal that they think that this is worth putting at least their time into. And so when I am interviewing or observing potential industry customers, I'm looking very hard for what are their workarounds and why is that working for them? Where is that failing? And anything we build with emerging technology has to reliably be better than how they're doing it now. And if they aren't
That's
doing it at all, then that's a bad sign.
but that's an interesting factor there. This reliably.
Mhm.
What does reliable look like? Is it that repeated use? Is it a matter of accuracy? How would you benchmark that?
It's going to depend on what the important metrics are for your users. But the example I really think about a lot is warehouse picking, because you have these people in warehouses who are timed down to the second, who have to get to bins and pick things back and put them away. And, somebody's actual livelihood can depend on how efficient they are at doing this work. And so if your device suddenly loses signal or goes down or reboots, then that has a real human cost associated with it. And it's not like somebody's desktop computer going down for a while and they just go get lunch. So we need to, it goes back to that importance of understanding the larger systems at play and what kind of tolerance they have for error of any type.
Now, 2023 and 2024 have been tough ones for product teams. They're constantly been reorganizing. There's a lot of mandates to do more with less, and basically a lot of research functions have been laid off, and it's a big point of contention, in the research community as to why they've been defunded. Do you think that the surge of investment into AI and other emerging tech is going to create a new need for R&D and a new kind of explosion of like human-centered and human-computer interaction kind of research?
That would be nice, wouldn't it? I have to say, I can't say that I have a really great, clear sense of what will happen. But what I can say is from my vantage point, working with people who do a lot of research, is that I still see that research is incredibly valuable. The clients I'm working with are getting very large returns on the studies that they are doing. I think there's clearly a need to shift the way research is being used, try to move away from box ticking, where you are just doing a study because it's the next thing in the task, but making sure that there's really an incentive to use those insights. And that if there's not, you're focusing that research on a question where it will be used. But I also think that research roles may end up changing, because what I'm seeing with a lot of more senior and experienced researchers is that they are changing their roles in order to find places that they can still use their research skills, but drive that greater impact and that greater strategic and operational impact that they weren't able to find in their research roles. So my hope is that we will start to see research inform more strategic questions throughout our businesses end to end. But I think that the form and the types of roles that researchers take on may change.
And if we had a product leader here in the room and they have a new product coming out, what are the types of questions that you would encourage them to leverage qualitative research specifically for?
Yes. So for emerging technology, um, I think it is so important to get research in the room when you are establishing your business models from the get go. And it's so interesting how often product management or some other part of the company will come up with that original product vision, that original idea of the business model. And research is only brought in after the fact to do product discovery, to guide execution. But I've seen a lot of success with teams that build research into their product strategy, that have them sit right with their product strategy teams. And that can be a really effective way to make sure resources are getting directed the right way to begin with, and you don't have these costly pivots later on.
let's say for someone who's maybe more of a mid-level UX researcher or someone who's been more of like just a general technology researcher, what type of skills or mindsets should they be shifting and really honing to allow them to pivot into these, emerging tech research roles? Because so far, I think a lot of the methods that you've talked about have been very traditional. But what are some that are maybe more specific to emerging tech and to what people need to ladder up their skill set for?
Yeah. So what's really interesting about research is I think the toolkit itself is very simple. There are new methods that come out. I've certainly, I used to work with biometrics and electrodermal activity and eye gaze and all of those things. But we come back to our core methods for a reason because they are very powerful. And so I think the first piece of advice I guess I would give for someone in this situation is to recognize that your research skills have so much value, not just in the context of product development, but in the context of the larger business. And so I think it's so important to give ourselves permission to apply our research skills to bigger questions and not stay in our lane just because that is where we were put. I have clients who are using research for lots of things beyond product development, such as improving their operations and answering those big questions that keep their CEO up at night. And what's really interesting is a lot of times they don't even have to run a new study to do that, but they have so much data in their organization and they have these great synthesis skills to combine these insights in new ways and come up with this really powerful direction that's based on evidence.
So I want to end this on an exciting note, which is on June 5th, you're going to be talking all about biometric data, privacy laws, and how to leverage things like Wonder Studio to be able to overcome some of those biometric privacy issues. Where do you see new opportunities for researchers or consultants in this space to really make a name for themselves in light of these changing biometric privacy laws?
I think there's a real tendency to go along with what your legal department says because we tend to see legal as something that is remote and scary and absolute. But what I have really been learning in the course of having my own business and doing this work with biometric privacy laws is that the law is not quite as black and white as we all think. Um, any decision you make around your retention of users' information is based on your legal department's risk tolerance. So it is a negotiation. So I think that the researchers and the people who use research who are going to have a lot of impact in this new world are ones that don't just blindly hand over their user research recordings, because there's a reason why that has been a best practice for so long. There's a lot of value in being able to retain those recordings. But at the same time, the law has made it clear that there are legitimate reasons why consumers and our users should be concerned about us holding on to their personal data. So I think there's going to be a lot of impact in finding creative ways to hold on to the good parts of our recordings, but also to respect our users' privacy, to find ways of keeping up with these biometric privacy laws as they continue to adapt and evolve. But I don't think it's all or nothing. I think we're going to be able to find ways to keep our recordings, but also protect our users. And that's what's exciting to me.
Thank you for listening to the Design of AI podcast. The show is hosted by Brittany Hobbs and Arpi Drag-Figueredo. Subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, or Apple to get our latest episodes. We speak to leaders at the forefront of AI to learn how great AI products are designed and how they're transforming industries. To contact us, visit our website, designof.ai.